Good afternoon, Professor Paolo Taticchi.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to Kenya, and I would just first like you to introduce yourself. I know you are a professor at UCL College, University of London in Strategy and Sustainability. You're also a visiting professor at Imperial College, and amongst many things you do as a consultant, you're also an advisor to the Ministry of the Environment in Italy. Italy and London are far away from here. What brings you to Kenya? And tell us a little bit more about your work.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I'm an academic. I'm based in London. I've been there for 12 years now. And I have the pleasure, the opportunity to work in two of the top 10 universities in the world, Imperial and UCL. I'm specialized in sustainability, and I focus on how companies can integrate sustainability in a meaningful way into strategy and business models. So not only they become more responsible, but they can also explore opportunities associated to sustainability. So that's most of my research and projects, and I'm very active in writing books and in helping organizations to work on these type of projects. For the last few years, I've been part of a task force in Italy that is associated to the Ministry for the Environment, and that basically involves also discussing the topic of sustainability in business in the context of policy making, which is, of course, a very interesting debate and conversation. And I'm very active as an entrepreneur and public speaker in that space. What brings you to Kenya? It's really a fantastic project. I'm here advising an NGO, Bomu Hospital. They have operations in a number of cities in Kenya, with the main operation being in Mombasa. It's a fantastic story of social impact. They have been operating for a few decades now, offering healthcare services, especially with a focus on HIV. Truly, helping the region to address this, terrible problem, and doing, really fantastic work over the years. So now I'm trying to provide some advice on the future in terms of how the business model could evolve, and also advice in terms of how to report on the social impact that they have, because measuring and reporting social impact is something very tricky, but it kind of fits in my area of expertise.
Great. So I think many of us have heard the word sustainability. We might get it confused sometimes with the concept of corporate social responsibility. Is the S sustainability? Is it social? Is it both? Can you explain to us the difference between CSR and corporate sustainability?
Sure, and I guess that's a very important difference, and no surprise that there is still confusion there, because the topic of sustainability has changed a lot in the last 20 years, and I guess the difference is very clear now, but it was less clear before. So basically, you could describe CSR, corporate social responsibility, substantially as the sustainability of the past. So the concept of CSR is something that was basically became popular in the 70s and shaped the work of corporations in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it was basically linked to the idea that corporations, in order to be good corporate citizens in society, they should basically take into account their negative impacts, for example, on the environment, or negative impacts on the local communities, and therefore should give back to society by using a part of the revenue or part of the profit generated to basically support initiatives that create a positive impact. So CSR is really built around, if you want, an offsetting logic, and around the philanthropic logic. And that's probably where the problem lies. If you push, very profitable organizations are not really pushed to address their negative impacts under a CSR framework. They tend to simply focus on doing something good, but at times this leads to marketing and at times to greenwashing, something that we have experienced a lot, unfortunately, in the past. So in the last 20 years, I guess it became clear that approaches based on CSR do not help to transform business. They do not help to, I guess, advance, the business models of organizations.
So is it because CSR was seen as a little bit superficial and not?
It's basically marketing and communication. It doesn't really, push organizations to change their strategies or change their business models. But today the situation is different. Today organizations are exposed to risks associated to environmental, social and governance topics, what is called ESG. And there are also a lot of opportunities in the market associated to ESG. So the business case is different. It's not anymore a business case based on marketing or communication. It's a business case based on strategy. Okay, sustainability is a strategy topic. And today, a good definition of sustainability could be that sustainability is about creating shared value. Is about creating revenue and profit in a responsible way, but it's also about creating value for a plurality of stakeholders at the same time, creating value for local communities, creating value for employees, creating value for business partners. So you achieve that, of course, by integrating ESG factors in decision making and by moving away from approaches based on CSR. So this is like the modern view of corporate sustainability.
So it's evolved from CSR, it's now ESG.
Exactly. So ESG are the topics that you need to address in order to build a sustainable organization. So sustainability is a journey, is a long-term objective. You basically become more sustainable by working on many aspects of the business that are important to achieve sustainability. So, for example, when it comes to the environmental dimension of sustainability, addressing waste is something that is relevant, but is also relevant to address carbon. It is also relevant to explore more circular business models. So these are example of topics that go under the
ESG.
Exactly under the S.
And they would not have been there under CSR. Is that
exactly.
the CSR too narrow?
No, I think of course the CSR in the past has focused on many topics. So of course organizations may have developed the CSR programs where they were supporting initiatives with a focus on the environment or supporting initiatives with a focus on local communities. But it was basically a give-back logic. It was something disconnected from the real core business. So another way to look at this is from a time perspective. So when you have an approach based on CSR, you have a business activity, you produce a revenue, and then in a second moment, you use a part of that revenue to do something good. While under the modern definition of corporate sustainability, first you try to avoid the negative things in the first place, so you try to produce a good revenue, good profit, but at the same time you try to achieve a social impact and a positive impact on society. So it is synchronous, the shared value creation, while in the context of CSR is asynchronous.
So, I mean, it sounds like there would be definitely corporations who would find this easier to do. So what happens if you're in a corporation that is, you're essentially producing oil commercially? I mean, how would you have this ESG program so that you're sustainable while at the same time, sort of doing good? I'm trying to understand how that marries.
So, of course, sustainability is country-specific and industry-specific. Okay, so discussing sustainability in the mining sector in Peru is completely different from discussing sustainability in the fashion sector in Italy. So that's something to keep in mind. So sustainability is a journey for everyone, and is a different journey based on the circumstances and based on the industry. Now, oil and gas, of course, is a very interesting industry for discussing sustainability because is an industry that on one side, I guess we could label as unsustainable, because we know that as a society we need to move away from the use of fossil fuels. But I guess we also need to be pragmatic and realistic, that maybe it is easier, for example, for developed economies to move away from fossil fuels, but fossil fuels are needed and will be needed in developing countries. So basically, it's an industry that is forced and pushed to manage a transition. Okay. Now we need to understand that that push is not only coming from government. Is something that would happen naturally in any case. Okay. So if you are looking at the availability of oil, we are looking more or less at maybe 50-55 years. When you look at gas and coal, you are probably looking at the double of that. So in any case, is an industry on a countdown. But what is interesting is that if you look at some of the big players, they developed very interesting sustainability agendas, and I'm referring to companies like BP, like Petronas, or companies like Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia. They basically know that there are a lot of business opportunities associated to the energy transition. So on one side, of course, they try to protect their traditional old core business. But on the other side, they are already investing heavily on the energy transition and renewable energies. So I was, for example, recently in Saudi Arabia, visiting Saudi Aramco in Dammam. And of course, they are the largest company in the world, and they are in the oil and gas sector. But it's quite impressive, the capital that they are investing on renewable energies, on alternative fuels, because of course, this is not, for them anymore. The future is the near term. And they do realize that. And they also have the capitals that are needed for investing on these things. So I think they are pushed to a transition not only by governments, but also by market opportunities. I think this is happening more and more, that companies are engaging with sustainable transformation, not because they are driven by compliance, but because they are driven by the
opportunity.
Market.
So they can see a positive opportunity for
Correct.
them to capture. So you touched on something. Aramco, obviously hugely profitable, tremendous reserves of capital to invest. Coming back to Africa, we have countries in different spaces. So in Kenya, we have a lot of renewable resources like wind, and hydro, but other countries not the same. South Africa, Nigeria, very dependent on fossil fuels. There is a cost to the transition. So what is your argument as a consultant when you're trying to persuade companies to do the right thing, to embrace sustainability, knowing that there will be a cost to them?
Yeah. So my experience suggests that it's very hard to convince executives to do the right thing. So the business case very often is not built on values or societal needs, is built on a traditional business logic. Okay. The traditional business logic is substantially based on risks, and opportunities. So when you do not engage with sustainable transformation, there are the risks that you face. Risks associated, for example, to losing certain type of clients. There are risks associated in terms of, for example, losing opportunities that are there in the context of sustainable finance today, for example. Risks associated to not being able to attract talent in organizations. And of course, topics that are, that can be a risk, they can also be opportunities. So I guess, and then of course there is a topic of compliance, which is, I guess, not necessarily relevant for African organizations, but is, for example, very relevant in Europe, in my part of the world, because the European Union is pushing a huge amount of ESG legislation that is, really driving, real change in industry.
I saw something recently. Is there an EU draft directive on environmental due diligence, or is it ESG?
Yeah, so there is like all sort of things. There is a kind of a new directive with a focus on due diligence that is kind of making a lot of rumor, but is not yet fully approved. But what is approved, and that's a big deal, is a directive called CSRD, which is basically creating new laws for sustainability reporting and made sustainability reporting mandatory for organizations with more than 250 employees. And this was, the previous law was basically making sustainability reporting mandatory for organizations with more than 500 employees. So they cut by half the size of companies that are pushed to disclose on sustainability. And just to give you an idea of the impact of that directive, I saw basically articles suggesting that just for Italy, for example, this new directive means that in the next 2 years, you are going to have closer to 20,000 Italian SMEs, 20,000 Italian SMEs, small to medium-sized companies that are going to disclose on sustainability for the first time. And this is, is driving real change, because in order to disclose on sustainability, you also need to have a strategy. So if you don't have a strategy, it's going to be hard to produce the sustainability reports. And this becomes relevant also for international organizations like African companies, large African corporations, because this directive is making sustainability reporting mandatory also for large international companies that have got big operations in Europe. Okay. So if you are a large company from Kenya and you do a lot of business in Italy, let's say, you will need to produce a sustainability report.
I assume it also it's relevant because indirectly the investors and lenders into African businesses will be asking the same questions that they have to report on.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise their strategy doesn't make sense.
Today you have, the finance community that is becoming genuinely engaged with the ESG topic. Exactly. So I guess this has been, happening for 10 years, but now there is momentum. So now you have, private equity firms that are using ESG criteria in the allocation of capital and in the management of their portfolios. You have banks that have created all sort of sustainable finance products for large companies and small companies that do, use the ESG criteria. And then of course, you have ESG rating agencies that create pressure on companies by, assessing their performance. So there is an entire, industry, linked to ESG data and finance solutions based on ESG that wasn't existing 10 years ago.
Which must be good for you because that's your specialism.
I guess that is, for me, it's of course something very interesting. So I don't do much work in the space of sustainable finance, even if I have some projects, some research projects that are looking at measuring social impact for impact investing, because most of my work is with corporates on the strategy side of things. But for me, sustainable finance is a real opportunity. And if you want, I can give you a very practical example of this. I published a case study on a company that I'm sure is a familiar name in Kenya as well. The company is Enel Group. Enel Group is a very big energy company, originally from Italy. Today, it's the largest provider of renewable energies in the world. So they operate internationally.
So they've changed to renewable.
Completely. So this was basically the strategy of the CEO, of the former CEO, that 10 years ago realized that there was going to be a major energy transition, and Enel was going to go in a different direction in any case. So he basically decided to disinvest very rapidly and massively from fossil fuels to basically go all in on renewable energies. And today they are the largest provider in the world. Now, what is interesting is that they basically started not only innovating their business model and innovating what they do, but they also were very smart in terms of exploring opportunities associated to sustainable finance. So they started with the use of, for example, green bonds to finance big renewable energy projects. But then at a certain point they had an idea in 2019 that was a brilliant idea. The idea was basically to issue a bond that was the first of its kind in the world, not linked to a project as green bonds are, but a bond linked to their strategy of sustainable transformation, so KPIs associated to the corporate strategy. They basically use the KPIs linked to decarbonization and the KPIs linked to equality, diversity, and inclusion in the corporation, and basically issued a very innovative bond, and they raised more than 20 billion euros with that bond.
Which they raised.
Exactly, and they created a market that wasn't existing before. Now that market is more than 300 billion euros. So what is interesting is that the market of sustainable finance was innovated by an energy company,
which used to be in fossil fuels.
Which used to be in fossil fuels, which now was basically seeking opportunities and was in a process of sustainable transformation. So today, Enel Group is one of these incredible stories of transformation, studied everywhere in the world.
And they took 10 years to make this transformation.
10 years.
So it's doable in Africa. I mean, we have countries where, because we don't have the same level of infrastructure as other countries, it's probably easier for some African countries to not invest in those fossil fuels as heavily and actually pivot to renewable.
Absolutely.
So, there is an opportunity there, isn't there?
I worked last year on a project for a very big engineering firm in Africa, Jeza Group. They are based, the headquarters is in Morocco, but they operate in several countries in Africa. A very big engineering firm. And basically, I helped them with their sustainability roadmap. And it was, really a fascinating experience for me to see, an African organization not only taking sustainability so seriously as a topic, but also looking at sustainability in a very strategic way. This means, understanding the market opportunities that are associated to the ecological transition and energy transition in Africa. So I don't believe they are an exception. I believe there are a lot of organizations today in Africa that do realize that there are opportunities and there are also risks associated to these transitions. So I think today companies do understand that sustainability is not the old CSR topic. Sustainability is something that should be discussed by executives, should be in the board agenda.
Yes.
It's a boardroom topic.
Yes. I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds obvious that sustainability as a topic is not really optional, but we know that, you're coming from an EU perspective where it's high on the agenda. Tell us about the different perspectives in the world, because I know we're not aligned on these issues.
So you are absolutely right. Different countries, different regions are, I guess, on different journeys, and they've got very different views on sustainability. The European region, and I would say the European Union here, historically has been kind of leading on this agenda for I guess a variety of reasons, probably values and I guess context being part of these reasons, but in the last 20 years they have pushed a very aggressive ESG agenda. And this, resulted in both governments and companies, I guess, being pushed to align, by these, vision and directives. I guess a region that followed was North America, and that basically is something that has been happening for a while. It changed quite significantly during the Trump administration because Trump had very vocal, strong views about certain ESG topics. And what is interesting is that despite certain views of the president or certain national, if you want, views, interests. There was basically an emerging of local action at the city level or at the corporate level. The greatest example is the C40 alliance, when basically Trump was pushing a narrative and the idea that the United States were going to be out of the Paris Agreement. Yes. At a certain point, there was a coalition of big cities in America that basically said that whatever the country does, we're going to do something different. We are going to align as a city.
Are these cities like California, by the way?
Like everywhere in the US.
Right.
But then what is interesting is that this triggered a global coalition, a global alliance. This is important because if you look at where carbon emissions are generated, they are generated in big cities.
Yes.
So this is like a meaningful action. So today the situation in North America is an interesting one, especially in the US, because there are some movements that are, I guess, against the adoption and integration of ESG in business decisions and capital allocation. So I think we need to wait for the next
we're going to
presidential
have an election,
exactly.
isn't it, this year?
We need to wait for August to understand where the US is going.
But I think it's interesting what you said, because I think we have maybe underestimated corporates' own incentives, which I think was your starting point.
Yeah,
they're not doing necessarily because they're being pushed. They're doing it because it makes business sense.
Because it's market driven.
And this is showing that despite government policy, you could still decide it makes sense.
Exactly.
What is the role for government policy? A lot of what you do is with corporates, but there must be a role for policy.
Oh, I guess the role of government is huge. I think the topic of sustainable development has been there for a while now. If you look at, for example, climate action, this is something that became hot in the agenda of governments from the 80s, from the Kyoto Protocol. But I guess we also learned that governments alone are not able to really drive these agendas. And that's why business that is a part of the problem is also part of the solution, and they can and should play an important role. So I think the very powerful combo is when you bring together government and business.
So can you give us a good example? Because I know you're advising the Ministry of Environment in Italy. Tell us, are you able to discuss some of what your task force does?
Yeah, of course.
That might give us some of us good ideas back in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, I was involved in a task force that before the war between Russia and Ukraine was basically looking at the existing incentives in Italy for fossil fuels, because unfortunately there are still incentives of that kind that we need to phase out. And basically this task force was basically looking at new policies with the goal of creating what is called a just transition. This means you can't just stop existing incentives. You need to phase them out in a fair way. So we were looking at basically new policies that were going to introduce basically incentives for renewable energies that somehow were going to balance the phase out of incentives for fossil fuels. And this was basically a very interesting exercise, because when you start working and discussing these type of policies, you realize that there are real challenges. You realize that there are many stakeholders. You realize that when introduce these type of laws, you do touch and affect the competitiveness of companies. So you need to be very, very careful to not harm industry. So I guess it takes time, and then of course you need to take into account that there are different political views in a country. So something that might, for example, make business sense, not necessarily make sense in an environment where in an environment of politics, because you have other stakeholders as well, including the public. So I think it's not an easy task, but let me say that at least in Italy, it's a little bit facilitated by the fact that substantially, laws and policies that are developed for sustainable development, they are substantially aligned to European Union directives. So we don't.
They have to be, surely, as
they
a
have
member.
to be. So basically, we don't need to be particularly creative at the country level. We just need to follow the EU indications and contextualize these suggestions to the country. So a lot of the high-level thinking takes place in Brussels.
Yeah. So, I mean, you talked about just transition. This is something you're grappling with in Italy. We talk about just transition in Africa a lot.
Of course.
I think for us it means something else, which is that why is there this pressure on Africa to develop in a particular way when no other developed country has shown that it has been able to develop without utilizing fossil fuels?
Yeah.
So I think in Africa it is a different debate, because what does just transition mean for Africa? Does it mean, for example, that we delay our sustainable development goals and we delay access to electricity and access to clean water in order to help the climate, the overall climate, when we did not contribute very much to the pollution? So I think it means something different. I don't know if you have any thing to say for people who say, sustainability cannot be at the cost of development goals. So
basically, your question is a brilliant question, and I guess it's not an easy one, but it's the one that has been discussed now for decades, and is basically is the type of question that in a way led, for example, to the Paris Agreement for climate change. So let me try to summarize why it is a complex question and why I guess certain policies are perceived as unfair. So when you look at, for example, climate change, okay, you are absolutely right when you say that climate change is something that has not been caused by developing countries. So if you look at basically carbon emissions and who polluted in the past, it's developed countries. It's countries like the United States, like European countries. Now, if you look at where carbon emissions are basically coming from today, the picture is different. Because you are looking, for example, at countries like China and India being responsible for a very significant portion of carbon emissions. But again, it's not that simple, because you could argue that, for example, an Italian organization delocalizing manufacturing activities in China is partially responsible for these carbon emissions if we are in a way counting these carbon emissions to China. So today there is this new topic of I guess carbon accounting that is a fascinating science. But let's say that let's work on the assumption that developed countries were responsible in the past and possibly developing countries are substantially responsible today. Now, if that is a true assumption, still there is a problem there, that we do want developed economies to take responsibility for the problem that did exactly they created in the past. And as you correctly said, when you ask developing countries to embrace sustainable development policies, substantially they are embrace costs that the developed countries didn't face at the time. So basically, if you ask Kenya today to go big with certain policies for sustainable development, that's in a way a very unfair request, because you're basically asking Kenya to spend more, and this means that this could potentially negatively impact on the economic development of Kenya. So that basically leads to the tension between developed and developing countries. Now, the Paris Agreement was probably the very first big success from a policy-making perspective, because it brought together developed and developing countries for an agreement on this. The agreement was based on the idea that developed economies should mobilize the capital in favor of developing countries in proportion to the size of their economies. And basically this capital should be used by the developing countries to basically address both mitigation and adaptation strategies. So in theory, there is a plan and there is an agreement. But now there is a lot of concern, and again, this is leading to...
There's a funding gap, right? So
there's a funding gap.
We're not seeing the money flowing.
Exactly. So what is happening is that developed economies, especially some of them, are not keeping their promise. Yes. So they are not mobilizing the capital that they should mobilize. And of course, this is again leading to very problematic conversations and tensions between countries. Now, I guess what is said about this is that doesn't matter what happens and who is responsible for this.
We all suffer.
We all suffer.
Unfortunately, I think the poorer countries suffer disproportionately more because
absolutely.
Actually, it's the poorer populations who are less able to adapt and protect themselves, right?
There is actually scientific evidence of this, that developed economies suffer more, for example, the consequences of extreme weather events.
Developing,
exactly.
Yes.
And what is also evident is that something like climate change is not just an environmental problem; it's a social problem. Because, for example, there are studies that show that climate events lead to migration between countries.
Yes.
And that kind of triggers all sorts of problems.
Things, yes. I think that's another topic we're interested in talking to other people, youth and migration. So yes, it does have societal impact, obviously.
It does.
It's a global phenomenon. I think turning back to private companies, you've written a lot around what can be done. There's a concept I think you've mentioned called gracious growth. Can you tell us what is gracious growth? Is it possible for a company making money to be gracious?
So that's, I guess, a very provocative concept. It's a concept that me and some colleagues proposed in a piece of research that we published a few years ago. And it was really inspired by the work of an Italian organization. So we didn't create the concept. This is basically language that was used by the concept. In Italian, they speak about crescita garbata, which translates into English into gracious growth. And this was basically developed by a company in luxury fashion. Brunello Cucinelli. Brunello Cucinelli is a
they
public.
make the handbags, right?
Yes, is a public company. They became famous for cashmere, but now they basically produce and offer total look for both men and women, including bags, and they are a very successful global luxury brand. What is basically special about Brunello Cucinelli is that since the very beginning, they always prioritize the people to profit. And they have basically taken a lot of unconventional decisions and developed a very unconventional and inspiring business practices to basically put people at the core of what they do, okay? So basically the
people as in employees,
communities, suppliers.
Right.
So this is basically what we studied in this research. And at a certain point, we basically started learning about this concept of gracious growth. That was very interesting to us. Because basically at a certain point, about 10 years ago, this company went public. So of course, when you are a private company, you can do whatever you want, right?
Exactly.
So you have the freedom of decision making. But when you go public, that's a different story. So when they went public, they decided to do something that again was unconventional. They decided to explain to investors and pitch investors that they were going to grow less than the average of competitors in luxury, right, because the type of growth that competitors typically have is not sustainable. Yes. This means if you wanted to balance economic sustainability with social sustainability and environmental sustainability, you have to moderate it. Okay. So that type of aggressive growth that many brands have traditionally in the luxury segment is not sustainable. So they basically pitched the market that Brunello Cucinelli SCPA, they had a different business model where basically economic profitability was balanced with environmental sustainability and social sustainability. And they basically convinced the market that this was going to be more sustainable in the long term. So this was.
So if you're making a long-term bet on them.
Exactly.
But if you're making a short-term one,
someone else.
Yeah.
So basically, this was a pitch that became very sound, for example, to long-term investors.
Are these like pension funds,
the big ones,
okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they entered the market, and since then, they've been doing extremely well. This means the financial community reacted well to this new idea of gracious growth. And I think it's an interesting concept. Now,
is it spreading or?
I think
what you can
so. I think we see a lot of business model innovation driven by sustainability today. So I guess generically speaking, yes, it is spreading. We have seen a lot of competitors of Brunello Cucinelli trying to emulate what Brunello Cucinelli was doing.
Is it possible if you're not really, it's not built in?
I think we kind of, first of all, go back to what I said at the beginning, that sustainability is country specific and industry specific. So you can't expect that to work everywhere. Yeah. But I guess what is interesting to me is that these stories are a good source of inspiration, and they demonstrate that it's possible to do business in a different way.
And to still make money.
And to still make money. So we do need these positive stories.
And we need them in Africa because we want sustainable, successful African businesses. We want all the S's, social, sustainable, successful, in Africa. And I think we have some of them. We just need more. Yeah. More examples,
and you need
more
to share
good
them.
practice. So, to wrap up, what would be the one piece of advice you would give a corporate that is ambitious, that might be considering doing something around sustainability? What can they do?
Yeah. I guess my advice is very simple. It's to look at the topic of sustainability as a strategy topic. So move away from approaches based on compliance, move away from approaches based on CSR, but basically try to look at the risks associated to not transforming in a sustainable direction and the opportunities linked to sustainable transformation. Because if you can figure out the risks and the opportunities, at that point the business case becomes very clear, and it's easier to identify new business models, new business strategies that can really have a positive impact on competitiveness, and strategies that have basically a commercial, perspective on sustainability.
Professor Paolo, it's been a pleasure. I hope this is your first, but hopefully not the last time we'll see you here. Thank you so much from ALN Academy. Goodbye.
It was my pleasure to be with you.